Move them down here. Okay. So first we have to finish off one last abstract expressionist I didn't get to talk about last time, just didn't have the time. And I want to do that because he's important. I think Barnett Newman is very important, and he isn't as well known as he should be. So we'll look at Barnett Newman briefly, because I just am drawn to him. I admire his brain. That's what always attracts me to artists is how they think. And I've been criticized for that, because not all art historians we're all different, and we're all attracted to different things, and we're all interested in different things. And I think I've spent a lot of time around a lot of people that are very object oriented, and they're just drawn to that object or that image, where I'm drawn to the ideas that the artist has, and the context in which it was made. So anyway, he's got an incredible brain. His concerns were very, very metaphysical. He has a background in studying religious philosophy, religious philosophy, and taught in New York for a while. But he was always fascinated with origins, like beginnings of things, how things start, and with the idea of sort of order out of chaos. And all this ties with this philosophical idea that he's interested in of this concept of Genesis. And that shows in some of his very earliest works. This is a work from 46, and it's called Genesis the Break. And it's where he's beginning to explore form as metaphor for these sort of big ideas. Like in this case, they're all interested in creativity. Weiss Pollock, de Kooning, and Rothko, particularly Pollock and de Kooning, were very interested in the idea of creativity and how the material inspires the artist, etc. This is a very different approach. It's not a material approach. It's definitely a philosophical approach. But that idea of creation and linking that to sort of Genesis, the essential creation, the beginning of all things, the ultimate creation, and then linking that to the idea of creation in terms of an artistic context is an interesting one. Something like this, it reminds me very much of the stories from the Kabbalah of creation that are rooted in the idea of the Zimzum. Anybody familiar with that concept? The idea that, it's my favorite creation story, the idea that before there was creation, before God created anything, there was just God. Think about it. If nothing's created, there's no differentiation. There's just one thing, and it's God. So for God to create something, he had to step back or step out in order to have a place for creation. And then creation is suddenly, now there's something that's not God. There's God and there's not God. Now you have two. Now you have the relative world. That's the world we live in. There are multiple things because we live in a relative world. I am me because I'm not you. We all exist in relation to one another. That's the relative world. But if there's only one thing, how do you relate to that? Because we can't really comprehend that idea because our minds aren't made to do that. This is a very Buddhist concept as well. So in order for God to make a space, he contracted to a single point. Now, can you imagine God contracting to a single point? And that's called the Zimzum. And I love it because it's like the Big Bang too. It's like there's this little single point, and it may be just a single point, but it's like God. So, and then you've got the Big Bang. It's such an interesting idea to sort of roll around in your head. So you've got this void, this undifferentiated void, and then you have creation. You have, in the Bible, then it's like separation of light and dark, and they also talk about it in the Bible as creation made this God, not God relationship, which is also described as good versus evil. So God is just, good is where God is, evil is where God is not. That's the biblical context. But it's the same idea of creation. Out of one big void, there is now something. And so he's searching for like a visual metaphor, not a symbol, not an allegory, but a metaphor for that idea. And so this is sort of a first attempt to sort of represent this primal break. In this, now this is interesting, the Euclidean abyss. Now that title's really interesting. You know, Euclid, of course, is the inventor of geometry, which is an attempt to sort of rationally describe and define the nature of existence. But he's calling it an abyss. It's like a dark, vast, empty space. He seems to be speaking about sort of the impotence of rationalism. Yeah, you can have mathematics and rationalism, but they're the abyss. They're never going to answer your question. A lot of artists have dealt with that idea of the failure of rationalism. Like, we can't really understand the world purely by numbers and a rational approach. So again, we get this sort of void, this sense of a void with a presence in the middle of it. There are certainly qualities here that remind us of some of that constructive art we've looked at, right? With rectangles and squares and things like that. But he's really rejecting that kind of sense of the constructive. It's not about building a new world or symbols that define the modern era. Is much more interested in the sort of transcendence of this emergence of order in the midst of chaos. Now, as much as this seems like a strange idea, I want to look at a painting from the 19th century of an artist who Barnett Newman was very aware of, who was actually interested in very similar ideas. Now, this is how a 19th century artist would express those concerns, but the concerns are the same. The issues they're dealing with are the same. Man standing before the void. In the 19th century, it was seen within the context of the sublime experience, and I'll define that. Barnett Newman said, man's first expression was a poetic outcry of awe and anger at this tragic state, at his own helplessness before the void. The purpose of man's first speech was an address to the unknowable. I love that concept. Now, what's Friedrich doing here? German romantic painter working in the early 19th century. We did look at it in the 19th century class, Monk by the Sea. And Friedrich tells us this monk is standing before this vast, unknowable void, and he's contemplating his own death. He's thinking about it. Now, the sublime as a concept, again, I talked about it in the 19th century class, was an idea that comes out of the philosophies of the late 18th century. The sublime is defined as something that we are attracted to, but also fearful of. There's a push and pull with something that's sublime. It's dangerous, frightening things that we're attracted to, but yet terrify us. And in the 19th century, they used things like images of storms and scary mountain peaks and places like that. An equivalent in our society would be things like mad slasher movies and riding roller coasters. These are things that frighten us, or like have you ever driven by like an automobile accident and you just want to peek over there? You know, we don't want to acknowledge that we are attracted to things like that, but we're attracted to things that are sometimes scary to us, but we just want to see them and repulsed at the same time. Now, one of the people in the late 18th century who wrote about the sublime was Edmund Burke, and Burke was read by a lot of artists. He wasn't really the best sort of philosopher talking about the sublime, but he was the one that artists read, so his influence was strong. And Burke said that the most sublime thing, and all sublime things are really rooted in one fear, and that's the fear of death. That at our core, we only fear one thing as human beings, and that is our own mortality. So he said that in art, things like vast distances, they trigger our fears of our own mortality, because they remind us that we are finite. Anything infinite reminds us that we aren't. So artists were doing things like this with these vast unknowable spaces as a symbol of the ultimate unknowable, or all of the things that we can never know, that are beyond our ability to comprehend, including and especially rooted in this idea of death. So here Friedrich has this tiny little monk, this vulnerable, frail little single figure, and he communicates that through the sort of three tiers, but particularly with that low horizon line, you get this vast sky. Now, it may be quite different looking from Newman's, but Newman actually wrote some articles on the sublime. He's very aware of all of these ideas and their history, and he's very much expressing that in these works. A series he's very well known for is the one-ment series, a term he made up. He took from the word atonement. And he's talking about here Jewish mysticism again, and the writings of Spinoza, a day of atonement, Yom Kippur, a day when you're supposed to contemplate your existence or the nature of your existence. And so one-ment comes from that. But by taking off the AT, he's emphasizing sort of oneness, how everything is linked. The one-ment series is where he begins to use what he calls his zip. And the zip is just this single vertical line, in this case, right down the middle. And the zip is a sort of analog for many of his key ideas. It's centered. It's a sign of our connectedness to all things. Symmetry always symbolizes balance and sort of perfection. He also referred to it as sort of an impulse, like, here's where he's sort of crossing over into, he's a color field painter, but I see elements of the gesture here where he's using the idea of the gesture, this mark, and he leaves it sort of rough, like you can see the mark making. And he leaves it there on purpose as a sort of sign of sort of an impulsive presence in his figures. He sees it, or he said it's also sort of an assertion of the sort of individual presence. The way we sort of have to concentrate on it. This will make more sense when we look at a couple of others in a minute. So it's the essence of creation again, the mark making of the artist, the sign of the presence of man, or not necessarily man, but the presence of something. So you've got the void, which is the field, and then the mark. Now there's something there. Now it's not just the void, there's a presence there. And I have to bring this back. Way back when we looked at the Russians, I told you I would bring this painting back. And this is where I like to look at Olga Rozanova. She was an early Russian painter, part of that suprematist group. She worked with Malevich. Remember the red squares and symbolizing the revolution and the building blocks of the new communist world. And then, but they're all hard-edged, they're all constructive blocks. In the middle of that, Olga Rozanova was giving us this, which in some ways was like Malevich, but in other ways is very different from Malevich and has more in common with what Barnett Newman is doing. I just find this painting for 1917 to be really unprecedented in terms of how she's making this mark. It does seem to speak of a presence, again, not a cold constructive brick that you're building a world out of, but rather something a bit more sort of visceral. I love the bleeding edges. It's more like a Rothko and a Newman than it is a Malevich. I don't know what's in her head. I haven't read anything she's written. I don't know that she's said anything about what she was doing. I just personally find it an intriguing painting. In this context of Barnett Newman, One-Ment 5, another one of those sort of celestial presences. And a sculpture. This sculpture called Here One, existentialism, we'll talk about a little bit more in the context of Giacometti in just a few minutes, but we've already talked about it in the context of Pollock and de Kooning, existentialism in the 50s was affecting people in this country and in Europe, and particularly Newman, who's interested in this idea of this lone individual presence in the middle of the vast void. I mean, that's about as existential as you can get in terms of an idea. But existentialism begins to replace the idea of creation. He's less interested in what is the nature of creation and now what is the nature of existence. Okay, so we're created, we're here. Now what is our nature as an existing being? And that's where existentialism begins to come into play. Yeah.
Is there a here too, or could that possibly be here
I've always wondered about that. I would like to be able to answer that question for you. I honestly think, look it up. You got your phone. I'm not sure there is a here too. I've thought the same thing for a long time, and I cannot remember whether I actually found a here too or not.
I mean, if he had done this over the...
Right. If there's no here too, then I'm going with the I, for sure. Because it makes sense. It makes sense that way. It makes sense that he would say, here I am. But what he's giving us now are like two zips. Only now they're three-dimensional, but now they have a relationship to one another. It's not just one thing existing, a presence in a void. It's now two things that now form a relative connection. One being slick and smooth edge, one being sort of rough edge, which is again a kind of personal sense of identity. These works, yeah.
Can you give us a brief definition of existentialism?
Do I have it here? No.
We all have one.
Yeah, existentialism was a philosophy, like I said, we're going to come on in just a minute, but it's looking at the nature of existence, but it sees us as being completely alone. There's no God in an existential world. There's nobody out there telling you what to do or what to be. We are totally alone and totally responsible and totally free. That's existentialist. And with the Beats in the 50s, it took a kind of a darker tone, like, oh my God, I'm alone. There's nobody else out there. I'm alone in the world. But it doesn't have to be a negative philosophy. That's just sort of how they took it. I think of the Beats as basically Buddhists without the path, because it's basically Buddhist beliefs as well. You're out there, you're alone, you're totally free to make your decisions and define who you are. Now, you could see that as a negative thing, or you could see that as a positive thing. It totally depends. But in the 50s, it was pretty negative. It was pretty down. Is there a here too?
Yes.
And a here three. Oh, okay. Darn. Yeah. Okay. I wanted it to be an I as well, but okay. So it's a here one. So like I said, we'll come back to that, but that idea of frailness and vulnerability is sort of, you can see here, and this is very influenced by Giacometti. Giacometti had just shown in 1948 in New York his tall, thin figures, which is what we're going to look at in just a few minutes, and they're totally existential, and that's influencing Newman. So while he's not showing this as a tall, thin, frail human being, he's giving us the analog of that in a non-objective image. That's certainly where it's coming from. Here's our vulnerable, utterly alone and vulnerable. I want to talk about, I know this is not a good image, but I wanted you to see the scale of this before I show it to you a little bit better. Vir Heroicus Sublimus, Man Heroic and Sublime, is certainly one of his better known pieces, not the most, of course, but certainly one of them, again, showing that he's been reading on the sublime. So what we've got here are 5 zips. The center, they're hard to see, but there are 5 of them there. The center is a perfect square, which is a perfect balanced form. He's sort of forcing you, this intensity of the colors, sort of forcing you to sort of focus on it. A lot of people were hostile to his works, partially because of the lack of painterliness. It was easier for people to respond to a Pollock Anna de Kooning because of their gesture marks. There was sort of emotion in there and things that humans could identify with. This is so separate from anything that anyone could identify with. The color field, he's still using the color field to evoke this sort of infinite world, the broad universe. It's very much about the zips. And you know, I don't want to go too much into this, but this is another version of what we were talking about before, because I want to get to his most famous series, and still have time to talk about all of the others. This is not his work, obviously. These are just images of the 14 Stations of the Cross, but the series Stations of the Cross is his most famous series of paintings, and where he puts these ideas into a sort of a more concrete context. After Vir Heroicus, such a negative response that he stopped painting for a couple of years, and he had a heart attack. And after the heart attack, it actually gave him sort of second life. He was determined to come back and sort of really, again, in a very existential way, redefine himself and begin again. And that's when he begins the Stations of the Cross series. There are 14 Stations of the Cross. They have changed over time. In fact, they changed in 1991. And then that was ratified in 2007. But so the details of them varies depending on whether you're looking at a painting from before 1991 or after. The nature, the specific stations change, but the Stations of the Cross are 14 points for those not raised Catholic or having studied art for a while. They are various points in this passage from the condemnation of Christ to finally his placement in the tomb. And there are different stories along the path. And there are various prayers associated with the Stations of the Cross. Now, his fascination with Christ is again, like many other artists of the period, is not specifically religious in any way. It's a symbol. It's a symbol of suffering. It's a symbol of the nature of human existence. And so he chose that path. They are today all located in the National Gallery, the East Building of the National Gallery. In fact, a whole wing was built just to house these paintings, and they're all in one space, so you can see them all together, and they're all in order, so you can visit them that way. They're I want to say black and white, but it's not white. It's a kind of ecru or off-white color with black, and it's a metaphorical journey. And I'll just look at a few of them. It's not a code to translate. You can't say, oh, black stands for this and the white stands for this. It isn't that simple, but it is a passage that we do try to, we can't help but try and read into it. This is the first station, Christ condemned. And in this case, we have sort of two zips. You have the black over on the left, and then here where it's actually kind of negative. You can see how he painted it. He laid a piece of tape down and then gesturally painted over the tape and then pulled the tape off, leaving this negative space. So it's a sort of negative positive space. It's a sort of presence, but not a presence, but absence. And there are many different ways you can interpret that. This is one of my very favorite of the whole group of 14. I really like the first one because there's something very powerful about those marks, the way he's combined color field edges with this gestural, this sort of almost ghostly gestural mark. It almost like vibrates. It's like electric. There's something about those black marks that I find really powerful. He's trying to evoke an experience, a universal experience here without a religious narrative. It's not.
What can I do for you?
What, did I do that? That was my watch. I bumped Siri on my watch and she answered on my computer. Well, that's interesting. I know that was possible. Then we've got the fourth station, Christ meets Mary. And you're beginning to get, an encroachment over here. These black lines are solidifying, and I'm jumping way up to the 12th station. You can see that the black is more and more dominant as it's moving across. And again, there's those marks, those two little gestural marks, those are on the painting. That's not a mistake, or it's not on the image. Back when we actually had to work with slides. Remember slides? Mm-hmm. You never knew what you were going to get to look at. I mean, the quality of how we had to look at art and teach art was just horrendous. Digital is so much better, but you would get weird things and you never know whether they were really on the painting or whether they were. But this really is on the painting. And then the 13th station, the deposition, and I can't see, it's really impossible for me to tell whether there's a black strip on the left or the right. It probably not. I think it's just the center panel and the big white panel. The deposition, so Christ is dead, so there's no sort of energy marking there. Deposition is when he's being taken down off the cross. Depositioning is what the deposition means. And then the final station is a white canvas, 14th station of the cross. The entombment, and that series is really, to me, the culmination of not only color field painting among the abstract expressionists, but in many ways the culmination of modernism. In a way, this is where modernism has brought us. There are actually at least 5 examples of all white paintings, of canvases that are solid white. And every one of them, and they're all late, they're mostly from the 50s, but they mean entirely different thing. What they are to each artist is something entirely different. And I just find that such a fascinating idea, that this is where we end in the 50s. Because modernism has sort of reached its end. It was almost at its end in the 50s, and it's not a dead end. Modernism was not a dead end, but it was a cul-de-sac. It was like a place you had to get to turn around and come back. And next week we're going to talk about what that means, and what is postmodernism? What does it mean to be after modernism, which is an important idea as well. Okay. I've chosen these artists to look at today for a number of reasons, because they don't neatly fit into any group, and that's more typical than not. The vast majority of artists don't fit into neat categories the way I've been teaching them. I do that because that's how you have to teach. You have to pigeonhole and group, and you want to communicate important ideas, so you organize things in a certain way to do that. And it leaves the impression that every artist must fit into some pigeonhole, and the vast majority do not. The vast majority don't fit into any pigeonhole or belong to any group. That doesn't mean they're not influenced by all the things that have happened. I also picked them because they're important artists. I mean, I don't want to leave them out. These are important people. And also because it's really good to look at them now, because these are artists, for the most part, who worked in the modernist period, but continued into the postmodernist period working as well. And also because you can see in every one of them a lot of all the things we've been talking about and how the different forms it takes. So they're good artists to wrap up modernism, because now we can see how it relates to, I'm not a cubist, I'm not an expressionist, I'm not a constructivist, I'm not a surrealist, but I'm still making modern art. And I can see a little bit of this in here, and I can see a little bit of that and a little bit of that. And that's where these artists come from. So they're a great way to sum up modernism to a great extent. And also many of them foreshadow the direction art is going to go after the modern period. So a couple of Americans, Alexander Calder and Joseph Cornell, who's one of my favorites. And then we'll go back and look at Giacometti, who's again, transcends these time periods. It was important early, but important very late as well. Francis Bacon, one of the most unique artists ever, and he's phenomenal, but wow. And Dubuffet, who's got a really unique take on things as well. So all of this is modernism. Alexander Calder was, I should say, a very interesting person. He's someone I wish I had gotten to know. You know, there's some people who you think, oh, I was probably a jerk and I couldn't care less if I ever met them. But Calder is somebody who I just really wish I had met. He was just a nice guy, a funny guy, a happy guy, and he just had this childlike quality like his whole life. He's like somebody you would want for your grandfather, or that kind of person. He was also typically American. He was the archetypal American, at least to European eyes. He's American, but he worked in Europe a lot. So Europeans knew him, but to them, he was what an American was, because he was a tinkerer and a toy maker. And they thought of Americans as people who could make things with their hands. Makers were American. Americans were makers in the European mind. And Calder was absolutely that. His father and grandfather were sculptors, so he comes into the art world early. And he actually, in the 20s, was a toy inventor. And you can see that, he's inventing toys. I think all of his work is toys to a certain extent. That's part of what he does. He's a maker, and he's a toy maker. His most famous piece that he worked on for much of his life was the circus. And Calder's circus is one of the most famous American works. If you go to the Whitney in New York, it's all spread out there. You can see the circus, his vast circus, and it's playful, it's inventive. He would put on performances for people. For him, it's a metaphor of life, of the artist's life, because, that's what art was to him. It influenced a great many other artists. He saw artists as entertainers. This is not a new idea. Actually, going back into the 18th century, there's a lot of art that links artists to entertainers, to performers, to circus performers even, and clowns. And because these were people who were on the fringes of society, sort of outsiders, and artists identified with that. So there is a long tradition of linking artists with performers of all different kinds. He works with all different materials. He's the kind of guy where you hand him some fabric and some wire and cardboard, and he'll make you a little thing that moves and moves around. Here are some of his creatures. A lot of them are kinetic. They move. They're on rollers and on wheels and the like. And you can see the playfulness of the circus pieces. By 1930, he had 5 huge cases filled with circus things, tents and animals and performers and other sorts of things that would get set out. Here's one of his lions. This is very reminiscent of sort of what they were doing, in the Bauhaus in the late 20s, where they were, bending and manipulating and just sort of playing with materials. Although he's not really interested in materials in the sort of intellectual way the Bauhaus artists were. He's just, making toys. He's just playing with his toys. Some of his wire pieces, now this isn't for the circus, but he does a lot of wire pieces like this. Josephine Baker, who's, I think, very recognizable. And she was like in the 20s, she was huge in Paris. She was like the star in Paris. And he's captured her here in this fun little wire sculptures. He's, of course, best known for his mobiles. You know who named him mobiles? Who came up with that name? It was Marcel Duchamp. Marcel Duchamp called them mobiles. I like that idea, that I could see Duchamp and Calder is an interesting pairing when I think of the two of them getting together, because Duchamp has a playfulness to him as well. There's a humor in all his work, but he's way, way intellectual compared to Calder, who wasn't at all. The idea of kinetic art, art that moves, certainly it comes from his circus pieces where you had things moving, but it also fits very much with the modernist aesthetic in terms of modern sculpture. Remember, it's not about mass. These are flat planes. There's mostly space. That's what modern sculpture was. And in this case, infinite, 39, Mahalinaj, remember Laszlo Mahalinaj at the Bauhaus? He was the one that taught that course of materials, but he also made kinetic sculpture. We looked at one of his pieces and I talked about how it moved and turned and he'd shine the light through it and you'd get all these different shadows, and it was used in theater productions and in some films and the like. So he's not really the only person thinking about kinetic sculpture or viewing things from multiple points of view. This is the essence of multiple points of view. You don't even have to move to get multiple points of view. The sculpture moves for you, and as it moves, it's sort of an infinite points of view, but it's Calder, so it's going to have a humor element to it. So it's lobster trap and fishtail. So there are references here, the lobster claw and what looks like the lobster trap, and they look like fishtail. So it's not just non-objective or abstract. He's giving it a context, one that's playful, if not overtly humorous, at least it's playful. It's certainly influenced by surrealism. Moreau in particular, Moreau was not the most well-known artist at the time. He was with the Surrealists, but later he is the most influential in later periods, right up through the 50s. And his sort of organic forms like these sort of fluid, organic, where he's inventing these other worlds. Certainly Calder's recognizing that and tapping into that. And even the flat planes, it's not geometric, it's organic, but nonetheless, it's this sense of flat planes. Most of Calder's are actually these primary colors. It's unusual to have this sort of orange. That's unusual for him. Usually they're painted the reds and the blues and the like, except for the one in Denver. Do you know the story of the Calder in the Denver airport? This was led to a groundbreaking legal case. It actually led to the Visual Artists' Rights Act of 1989 from lawsuits. Calder made huge, typical Calder mobile for the Denver airport, and it was in his typical colors of the reds and the blues. They repainted it in orange and blues, the colors of the Denver Broncos.
The color of what?
The Denver Broncos, orange and blue, the football team, right? Lawsuit. The thing is, there wasn't anything illegal about it. They bought it. At that time, you buy a work of art, you want to repaint it or whatever you want to do, that's okay. That's not okay today. It eventually led to the Visual Artists' Rights Act of 1989, and you no longer can change or deface or I forget, I have to look up the legal terminology, but you can't do whatever you want to a work of art just because you own it. It's only valid through the life of the artist. They tried to get it extended like a copyright or something, but they couldn't get it extended beyond the life of an artist. Now that's in this country. They're much stricter in Europe. It does extend beyond the life of an artist. But it actually came out of 2 or 3 different cases, but one of the first, the most prominent, was the Calder that got repainted.
There is a large Calder at the Bristol British Museum.
Hopefully it's
It's not been.
original. Right.
I don't think it's been repainted. In
Yeah, no, I'm sure it's not. I'm sure a museum
Did
wouldn't.
Calder bring the,
No, he didn't. Actually, under the Visual Artists' Rights Act, anyone has the right to take it to court. Anybody. It was done by just art people in this country who did it. It wasn't him. But yeah, that's the thing. You see somebody, and I still see people doing it all the time. I see people violating the visual arts. I mean, even things like, well, I don't want to get too much into the legal foundation of it. One of the shortfalls of the Visual Artists' Rights Act is that it does not encompass site-specific art. And they were trying to get that because there were a number of cases in the 70s and 80s where site-specific works were taken down, were taken down and removed. And they argued that to move a site-specific work of art is the same as destroying it. It was made for this site, this place, and its shape responds to this. And therefore, simply moving it is destroying it, but the courts wouldn't buy that. So it does not protect site-specific art. Anyway, that's a whole really interesting thing if you want to read up on the Visual Artists' Rights Act.
Peggy,
Yes.
I'm wondering what Wright would have thought about painting his church on the plaza.
That's a good question.
I mean, is he an artist or is he a builder?
The question is the building a work of art, not
Yes.
what he is. And I honestly don't know how this relates to architecture. I'm really not sure.
I just know that he had a fit when they painted it.
I don't think it does relate to architecture, but I could be wrong. I think it specifically mentions painting, sculpture, but again, I'd have to look that up. No, he wouldn't like it, but I don't think you can hold architecture quite the same standards as you do a painting or sculpture.
the architects just let you, but they reject it like they did the community church here.
Right, yeah.
Frank Lloyd Wright said, that's not my building.
Yeah, I don't think they could legally stop them from doing it. But again, I'm not up on the architecture part. Okay. Calder also made what, again, Marcel Duchamp named the stabile as opposed to the mobile. The stabile is basically everything that's not a mobile. Mobile is a stabile. And his works began getting bigger. I want to say something about this growing tendency toward public art. Public art is another whole issue in art that we don't have time to go into. Public art, of course, refers to really a couple of different, it's used in multiple ways, the term. In its broadest sense, it means art placed in any environment where you don't normally expect to see art. So if it's in an art museum, but if it's outside somewhere, like in the park or on a college campus or in front of a big corporate building, those are public art. It's art where people will see it who don't intentionally go for the purpose of seeing art. I mean, that's kind of the point. If you go into a museum, you're going there and expecting to see art, and you don't like it, tough, don't go in the door. But if it's outside and you can't help seeing it, people have a different relationship to that art because they feel it's being thrust upon them. And then to complicate the issue, you've got public art, sometimes the term referring to government-sponsored art, public meaning not just in a public place, but paid for by the public through your tax money. And that creates a different relationship between the viewer and the work, because I'm going to feel differently if I feel like my tax money went into paying to have that put here and I have to look at it. So that's why it's a really big, complicated issue. And particularly in the 80s, all sorts of legal ramifications. There are reasons why I'm not talking about government-sponsored art now. I'm just talking about art in public places. There are reasons why public art really takes off in the 60s and on from then. And if any city you go to, any big city, you're going to find, go downtown, you're going to find squares and open spaces where you've got big sculpture. And a lot of that has to do with what's called the percent for art movement, which began in the late 60s. And it starts locally. Cities started doing it. I think it's mostly local, where a city will say, okay, if you're putting up a building, you must dedicate usually like 1% or 2% of your cost to art for that building. You have to put something in front of it or inside it, a certain amount, it's like a percent for art. That corresponded with city ordinances that forced tall buildings to be set on a small proportion of the property. So, any tall building cannot be built, like a skyscraper cannot be built out to the sidewalk all the way around. In most cities, it can't take up more than 30% of the lot, and the 70% has to be open space. That's why you have skyscrapers with these plazas in front of them, because you can't have a city with buildings out to the sidewalk and then just narrow little streets that are wind vortexes. I mean, you can't do that. You have to have place for the air to move around. So if we're going to have this big open plaza, we got to put something there, right? So maybe it's a fountain, but often it's art. It also corresponds with the corporate art collecting phase. Almost every corporation today owns art. They have large art collections. They're all invested in art. And I've worked with a couple of different large corporations as advisors and selling them art. They all invest their money. Corporations have investments, just like banks have investments. And quite honestly, one of the very safest investments you will ever make is in art. Art almost never goes down in value. It just doesn't. It goes up. And sometimes if you have good advisors, it goes up a lot. So corporations invest very heavily in art. Even if they're not showing you all their art, they own art and they own a lot of it. So it's good business. You gotta invest right. And especially public art like this in front of your buildings or wherever, there's really certain things that work and certain things that don't. And Calder just fits perfectly. He is like the perfect public artist. His art is modern, it's very modern, but it's not in any way intimidating. Almost nobody hates Alexander Calder. How can you hate a Calder's work? I mean, you really can't. They're not confrontational. They're not aggressive. They're not what a lot of other art is in public spaces. They just work well. Actually, abstract art in public spaces is far more acceptable to the public than realistic art, because people don't take realistic art as seriously as they do abstract art. There are some people like, Oldenburg, right? The shuttlecocks. Those things are really controversial. You cannot put those anywhere but in a museum grounds. They will not be accepted by, you put those on a corporate plaza, there's going to be an uprising because people don't take it seriously. They think it's a joke, right? It's a shuttlecock. That's not art. But you put a Calder there and they'll accept it because they take it as serious. But anything like that real, Oldenburg has long history of trouble with public art, whatever he does. And almost all of it is on things like university campuses where it's okay, or museum campuses where it's okay, but not corporate. He just doesn't work there. So The Big Sale, and again, his titles are playful as well. I love some of his big ones. This is La Grande Vitesse, which means something like, speed, like great speed or great energy. There's something about Calder's large pieces like this that are very like alive, like they're great beasts, like it's a big dinosaur or something. There's something about that. They're also perfect for a large corporate space because of how they're made. They're flat planes with a lot of open space around them. You can walk through them and under them. What doesn't work is big, heavy, solid objects that have a lot of mass. It just doesn't fit the space right. It's too heavy. It blocks your view. You don't want to block the view. You don't want to block the space. You want to be able to walk. The public wants to be able to walk through and under it and not feel massive. So it has to be the right scale. I mean, these are big buildings, so it has to be big. It can't be too small or it looks silly. It can't be too big. It has to be light and airy and open and inviting. So it has to have a lot of properties, and Calder has all of them. The most beautiful. Flamingo is phenomenal. I love this piece in Chicago. It's in the Federal Plaza from 74. And again, the name flamingo, but it's this big creature. It's totally non-objective. Yeah, it just fits perfect. I love the colors. They stand out. There's something about those colors that remind me of like bridges. That orange is the primer color. When they prime an iron bridge, it'll be orange. Like some of them are just permanently orange because they just are constantly painting. I think the Golden Gate Bridge is constantly being painted, right? From one end to the other, and then they paint back and forth, but it's always just left this orange. So again, it speaks to something industrial, but playful.
What's 6 stories tall?
Hmm?
Oh, I was counting how many.
Oh, yeah, I don't know how tall that building is, but it's tall. I mean, it's a federal.
I'm looking at the window, so that would be it.
Oh, yeah. You can see. That's the.
I always think it looks like a caricature of Picasso's. Thing in Chicago.
I can see that. Yeah, there is a relationship there. I can see it. I don't think he's.
Are you familiar with Rita Blitz's stuff here in the city? Rita Blitz,
No.
large pieces like this. In fact, they gave a wing to some school in Wichita or somewhere recently, but she's a local artist. But she's got some big, they're like, I don't know, 12, 14 feet, but hers are more chrome type things and flowing type things. But
Cool.
she's local.
Right. Yeah, this is the public art is everywhere. Here's some more views of flamingo. From every point of view, you see it differently, but they're still wonderful animals.
One on the campus at Johnson County Community College. She's got one on the campus at Jewish Community Center. She's got several.
Yeah, there are thousands of them everywhere. Yeah, I love some of these photos. And of course, again, he also has one of the most famous pieces at the National Gallery in the East Building, right under the glass pyramid. So that's the classic example of the Calder. Joseph Cornell. Anybody ever heard of Joseph Cornell? He's not as well known. He should be. Well, he was a quieter guy. He was from Long Island, but he didn't hang around with the sort of New York crowd. Some people said he's the only American who really understood surrealism, but what he's doing is not really surrealism per se. He's the master of the found object, as we'll see in a minute. Cornell started making these things that he makes, and I don't like the word sculpture, and many artists don't like the word sculpture. They talk about objects they make. A sculpture has a certain connotation. It's like what you carve out of marble or cast in bronze. And what people do three-dimensionally today has nothing to do with that old methodology. So they don't like the word sculpture. It's just three-dimensional art or objects. But he had a brother who had cerebral palsy and was disabled. And he started making things for his brother that his brother would just enjoy. And that quality. You know, he's also a tinkerer. He's also an American, and there's also a sort of lighthearted quality to a lot of his works. If you go to the Chicago Art Institute, that's where you're going to see Joseph Cornell. They have an incredible collection of his pieces, and I could just spend hours in there looking at his works. He created shadow boxes, and the shadow box is a format that becomes popular with a number of different artists, but usually later, more in the 50s. It's a shallow box, often with maybe shelves or something in it. The shadow box itself, as an object or as a found object, has an interesting history and brings with it associations. And that's, I've mentioned it before, but that's what's so powerful about the found object. Is that any object you use in a work of art brings with it associations that layer the meaning of the work of art. And they also have different associations with different people. Like I might have an association with a certain kind of stuffed bird or whatever, and you have a different one. And so we're layering, and you get levels of meanings that create a richness in the overall piece and how each individual interprets them. The shadow box itself is something that I remember growing up with, and I'm hoping maybe some of you do too. People used to have them, you know, my grandmother, my aunts, I don't think my mother did, but a lot of her sisters did. They were like display cases, right? It was on your wall, and it was where you displayed collectibles. Actually goes back to the Victorian period. They begin in the Victorian period in the 19th century, because that's when collecting began. I mean, the obsession with collecting is a Victorian thing, and they would just have, you know, little thimbles or little whatever it is you collect. And so the whole idea of the shadow box as a display mechanism has associations with preciousness, a way of displaying things that you collected that matter to you. Just the format, no matter, this is before we even look at what's inside it. Just using the format carries those associations of something special or something, you know, that I'm presenting to you, something that matters to me. Then we get to the found objects. This particular series, and most of his works are in series, there'll be several pieces with the same name, with variations in terms of what it suggests. This is really where constructivism and surrealism come together. I love the way he's combining these ideas of structure and form with associations and subconscious and psychological associations. You know, the format of the shadow box itself is constructive. You know, you can see the verticals, horizontals, the rectangles, they become organizing mechanisms for organizing the space. You know, here's a square, this, and they suggest hierarchies and relationships. I mean, that's what Mondrian, do I have a Mondrian here? That's what Mondrian was all about, where Mondrian had the big red, the little blue, the little yellow. They suggest a hierarchy. This is most important, this is next, that is next. And they suggest this idea of how things relate to other things, the format alone. And in this case, he's giving us this same suggestive format. Now, it's suggestive and it's evocative, but it's not giving you an answer. It's like surrealism. I'm suggesting this idea, but I'm not, you know, telling you what something means. We get the inorganic and the organic, the reference to the circular forms that are repeated, the wonderful like little notes on the back wall where it says Hotel Eden there, the names, the bird, you know, what is this? What does this all mean? I don't know. I love the boards in the back. What's that called? There's a name, bead board. Is that what it's called? Those kind of strips of white, but they're sort of worn, like they're old. There's an aged quality to this, like you've discovered something old. It's like he takes like the detritus or refuse, you know, stuff that somebody threw out or whatever that's old and doesn't mean anything. And then he's treating it like it's precious again, and he's displaying it. He's putting it together to create this little environment. And the thing as a whole just creates a mood. This is a really strong mood to me. And maybe, you just have to see them in person to get it. But there's something nostalgic about it. It's reminding me of something, and I don't even know what. It's like taking me back to some place or some time. It's almost like I can, something at the beach. I mean, for me, it's going to be different for everybody else. But for me, there's some memory back in there that I don't have anymore. That's something about a beach house. And I can almost feel the wind. And that's what he's doing. He's creating something evocative. Sometimes he's more overt, like the Medici series. The Medici, of course, the family from the Italian, from Florence, Italian family during the Renaissance, banking family that were very, very powerful figures in the Renaissance. They were bankers throughout Europe. They were great patrons of the arts. So just the reference to Medici is just this flood of associations and meanings within the context of art. And he's giving us these sort of Renaissance images. But then the slot machine. I love that combination. And the way he's organized, sort of, again, this hierarchy of large areas, small areas, again, ordering out of chaos, it is evocative of a slot machine. It's like the things, the numbers going across, or the spinning, you see the wheel spinning, and there's an element of that. What's he saying about that? Not sure. I love that spring thing at the bottom in the middle. He had that in the previous image, something like that up there. People have said it suggests like the solar system or the universe, as things are spinning around. There's something evocative there. Those blocks down below, don't know, but it's evocative. And then more, the Medici prince, Medici princess. There's a number of the Medici series. But I think my favorite series of Cornell's are the soap bubble series, because they really are bringing in some interesting sort of formal relationships. Soap bubbles. There's all sorts of forms here that are repeated and referenced. Soap bubble set. This is one of them.
Pipe.
A bubble pipe. The cork. There's a reference to solar systems on the left. The cork balls. But then the bubble pipe, and there's almost looks like there's a circular sphere like rising out of the bubble pipe. So the cork balls are like bubbles as well, but they're also like marbles. Now the shelves are glass, like the marbles, they're translucent, but the glass shelves are like, not only are the marbles translucent, but bubbles are translucent, relating to glass. And then you've got three glasses, which are glass and translucent, like the shelves and the marbles. And then in the glasses, it looks like a couple of little cork, but now squares. Now he's challenging. He's giving us now, everything's circular, but now we've got the little squares. Of course, the whole thing is divided into squares, 2 squares on each side in a rectangle. I can't tell what's in the middle of that one center glass. But, behind them, you get all the circular forms. So it's like all these images of shapes and forms are sort of all layering and coming together as they seem to rise. It's just, again, playful. It's something you would make and then just look at and talk about. You see the surreal influences here. This isn't surrealism per se. He's not trying to speak about his subconscious mind, but he's certainly tapping into that free flowing action of the brain, where the surrealist tapped into sort of dream imagery. It was linking this, links to this, links to this. That's very sort of psychoanalytic. He's sort of tapping into all of that. And then here's another soap bubble set where once again we get, I think that looks like the moon. Yeah, it is the moon. And then now we've still got the bubble. We've got the bubble pipe still. We've got the glass on the left now with an egg in it. So we're varying from the sphere to now the egg. There's two different but somehow related forms. And then the sort of Cupid doll head on the right, which also has more of the egg form. It's not the sphere form. And then whatever those are up above, if those are, I don't know if those are cups.
Cylinders, anyway.
Cylinders, yeah, I don't know what they're supposed to be, but I love the two with images. The one on the right is like a city with, I don't know whether that's supposed to be like Saturn or something above it, or a flying saucer or something above the city. And the one on the left isn't like I don't know if that's supposed to be like a circus horse. I don't know if you can tell, but it looks like, again, a Saturn-like form over it with a ring around it. But see, that's what they do, is they pull you in as you attempt to decipher what each thing could possibly be referencing. I should go to Chicago and look at the rooms full, because so many, and there's so many, we could have spent a lot of time, but just moving from one to one are absolutely fascinating. And they have them in this sort of darkish room, so that when you go in, you know, your focus is right on this shadow box. It's not like it's a bright room and there's a lot of other stuff. It's a small, quiet space, and you really can like focus on them. It's very almost a meditative space. It's a great way to see them. Okay, briefly, Giacometti, Alberto Giacometti. Swiss-born artist. We're not looking again at his whole career. There's too much. Doesn't he look like one of the Marx brothers? Absolutely. It always reminds me of him. Obviously, he's from an Italian family, but he's really Swiss. He was born in Switzerland and grew up there. Again, an artistic family. That's not uncommon to have other artists in the family. Went to Paris in 22, along with his brother, Diego. And I think Diego was like a furniture designer or something. I have to check this. He was an artist, but he wasn't like a painter or a sculptor. I think he did furniture. Giacometti, in the 30s in Paris, was part of the Surrealist group briefly. He was sort of really kind of a member of the group until they kicked him out, which they typically formally did. This is one of his works while he was with them, not what we would normally recognize as a Giacometti, but a lot of his early work is more like this: cage, very surrealist subject, like a dislocated human form in the cage. But he was always drawn to the figure and began working with the figure again in the 30s. And that's when the Surrealists derided him for that. They were very snobbish, and they, formally expelled him in 1935 because he was working with the figure in a more traditional way. He stopped, for a long time. He sort of left art. I think about 5 years he didn't make anything, and then he got back into art making through drawing, and his drawings are really quite incredible. They're not often as well known as his sculpture, but his drawings are really what led him into his late sculptural work, and you can see it in this wonderful drawing of Annette and this massive figure behind her. This is what drew him to his tall figures. He was very close to the existentialist circle in Paris. In fact, one of his best friends was Jean-Paul Sartre, the essential existentialist. And this is one of his earliest moving back into the figure style. This is the same year as the drawing we just looked at, his very famous tall, thin figures. He felt the need to break free from his past and redefine himself, influenced by existentialism. I mean, that's what existentialism says. There's nothing out there telling you what you have to be. You are 100% free at every moment to redefine yourself, begin again, be, who you are. You're reborn every day. I mean, you can't get much more Zen than that. That's the foundation of Zen philosophy. And so he's attracted to that. This is an incredible piece. This massive bass and this huge, heavy, literally, I don't mean big, I mean massive bass with this little tiny figure on it is a really powerful expression as an individual piece. The figure is just tiny. It's one way to show sort of the vulnerability of the individual. But this is what he's most known for. You know what this always reminds me of? Did you see like Close Encounters of the Third Kind, the movie? Okay, there's one scene where like it opens up and this tall, thin alien reaches out. And the minute he walked out, I went, Giacometti, Giacometti. I swear that's where they got the figure from. It was a Giacometti was the alien. I know that's where they got it. And he was reaching out like just like this. So I'm sure that's where they got the design. So here a little more on existentialism. Free and responsible, alone and vulnerable, but free. These were well known in Europe and first exhibited in 1948 in New York. So we know that Barnett Newman saw these. And the exhibition catalog essay was written by Jean-Paul Sartre. And in it, he specifically talks about existentialism and these figures. He called them, the fragile presence of humanity. You can't get more, it's straightforward. I'm telling you what these mean right here in the catalog. There's something else that I always think of when I see this piece. The very first time I saw it and every time since then, probably a fairly little known piece of Greek sculpture, but I know this piece very well because my background is in Greek art. The Poseidon of Artemisia. And it's actually a very well known among the archaeological circle, but it's not one that appears in a lot of the introductory textbooks. So a lot of people don't know this sculpture from 5th century BC Greece. But I can't help but see a relationship. Now, I'm not suggesting Giacometti knew this piece or was influenced by it. Not at all. But I think they're both wonderful archetypes for a moment in time and a way of thinking about the nature of existence and who we are as beings. The Poseidon of Artemisia, which is immensely controversial in the archaeological world for the stupidest reasons, half the archaeologists believe this is Zeus and the other half believe it's Poseidon. And there are an infinite number of I did a whole research paper on it. So I can verify this is Poseidon. And it all has to do with his fingers, how his fingers of his right hand. That's how you hold a trident. Poseidon throws a trident, Zeus throws a thunderbolt, and you grasp a thunderbolt like this and you throw it down, but you grasp a trident like that with your index finger out. These are issues. These are important issues. You need to know. I love it, and that's Poseidon. So forever, I don't care what this says in any book ever again. This is the Poseidon of Artemisia. Okay, and then someone else said, "Yeah, but they were brothers, so they're going to look alike." Anyway, it's a perfect example of classical Greek sculpture, right at the height, 460. Actually, it's slightly early classical, but nonetheless, it's idealized. It's the perfect physical being. This is what you aspired to. This is what the human form was in the classical world. That's really what we mean by classical. It's the heroic and it's the ideal. It's chosen by the gods, honored by the gods. If you have a physique like this, you are touched by the gods. And then we get to the modern. I mean, to me, it's like the ancient and the modern, these two different ways of seeing our existence. And when we get to Giacometti, here's the same sort of pose, but it's now, he's not touched by anybody. He's this really helpless, frail, but now totally free. In the Greek world, you weren't free. I mean, every Greek tragedy and drama is about fate. It's about, no matter what you do, you are subject to your fate, and that's it. I mean, that's what tragedy was. It didn't matter what you did, this is going to happen to you. And so it's which do you want? Do you want to be vulnerable and free, or do you want to be sort of ideal but not free? Your path is chosen for you, etc. So philosophically, you could write an interesting essay on comparing these two. And I've never seen it done. Nobody's ever done it. Maybe I should write an article, but that's too much work. I don't feel like doing that anymore. But it's there. I mean, there's a really interesting article there if somebody would wish to undertake it. The city square, also an interesting statement here, not as big, but nonetheless, it's still these vulnerable people, the way they're all moving toward one another, but you get this feeling that they're going to walk right by. Right? You don't feel like they're going to meet in the middle and have a nice conversation. It doesn't feel that way. It's disconnected. And I also love the feet, the way they're sort of attached to the ground. I mean, this isn't huge, so they don't have to be big, heavy, clunky feet. They're stuck to the ground. It's I don't know, there's something odd about the way they're glued to the ground. But I love the city square. And what's that saying? Not just about the individual, but about society and how we as individuals interact, or more appropriately, don't interact with one another. It's disquieting, the alienation of modern society as well. Just a couple more quick ones. Some of his later works, the figures dissolve more. There's less physical there. The one on the left is barely recognizable as a figure. And then by 1950, I love the idea of the four figures. This is very reminiscent of symbolist art. He's getting into back in the 1890s, a lot of the symbolist art and those influenced by the symbolist would use these rhythmic patterns, these repetitions. I'm thinking of Hodler and some of those artists we looked at, but I'm also thinking of Monet, late Monet, who's influenced by the symbolist, where he's setting up these poplar trees in this row, and they set up this rhythm. It's a motif. That sort of repetition is a motif that creates certain associations. But I love the way they're just dissolving, and the rough surfaces. Yeah, did you?
Just a question, looking at these dates, what during the war, what is it besides during the war?
He went to Switzerland. He was in Switzerland during the war.
Okay.
So he wasn't involved with the war. As a Swiss citizen, yeah, he got out and spent it separate. Okay, who's heard of Francis Bacon? You will remember Francis Bacon after this.
There's a new autobiography that just came out this spring.
A biography on him?
I think it says I, Francis Bacon, or so. I've been wanting to buy it.
Ooh.
$23 or something.
Yeah. It'll be interesting. I guarantee it'll be interesting. British artists. We haven't looked at a lot of British art in the 20th century, other than Magritte. Well, that's Belgian. England didn't have a huge contemporary art in general. The visual arts in general are not the forte of of Britain. I mean, they're a literary nation. Literature is their foundation, always has been, and it still is the dominant art form. Francis Bacon is actually Irish. He was born in Dublin, but he was gay, which was not an okay thing in Ireland in 1910. He was thrown out of his home at the age of 16 and went to London. Became an interior designer. I think he had a very rough life, and he had a very dark view. He's also, or was also, sort of notorious in the art world as someone, he just off-putting. He wouldn't do interviews. He wouldn't be photographed. He just didn't want to interact with anybody. He also, like in the 80s, when I was working at the gallery here, his work was, highly sought after. He was always pretty successful once he became popular, and you could never get his art. When he made a new painting, it went immediately to its owner. He's like lists of people who want his art. There's no such thing as finding a Bacon. And like the holy grail in the art world was finding a Francis Bacon. Everybody wants them. And art dealers, one of the jobs of art dealers is to shake loose art. It's what it's called, shaking it loose. It's like somebody will come to you and they want an early Monet, or they want a Renoir, or they want a Francis Bacon, and you go out there and try and find them, find somebody that owns one, talk them into selling it. That's like shaking it loose. It's the art world is not all what people think. The art world isn't necessarily, here's this art, I want to sell it to you. It's like, I want to buy this art, go find it for me. And Bacon was the hardest to shake loose. If he finished it, it was like promised, immediately. And that just adds to the mystique. It adds to the desirability. He didn't make a lot, a couple a year, man, and people wanted him. That's my main memory of Francis Bacon. He had no formal training, but he was strongly influenced by surrealism. There was a good sized circle in London of the surrealists, of British surrealists. He stopped painting for about 10 years. At one point, he did a series of crucifixion scenes. He's another one that looks at crucifixion images as sort of metaphors. And I think he identified as someone who had a really hard, difficult life, identified with it. Stopped painting after he got some really disappointing responses to some works that he did in 33, and he stopped painting for like more than 10 years until 44. He painted this group, which absolutely solidified his career from that moment on. These are incredible images. 3 studies for figures at the base of a crucifixion. And they're based on not any one particular painting from the past, but examples of hundreds and hundreds of paintings of the crucifixion where there'll be these figures, unidentifiable figures, the base of the cross, that are moaning and pulling their hair out and sort of tormented people. And that's what it's based on. But now he's taking them and putting them at the center. These are oil paintings, but he worked in a way that was sort of very thin and layered them. His technique was sort of different from many of them. It's based on a series of drawings he did for the Eumenides by Aeschylus. Eumenides is one of the plays written by Aeschylus, a Greek writer who wrote a series that it's the Orestes series, of the story of Orestes, and there are several plays, and the Eumenides is one of them. The Eumenides were the Furies, and the Furies were in Greek mythology. I think there were 4 of them, whatever, but they like tormented you. They followed you around and enacted what was called divine retribution. And there are stories of people that were tormented by the Furies. And so he's identifying with them here in these drawings. That image on the left is horrific. That is more horrific than any surrealist painting I've ever seen, that sort of tormented, screaming mouth. And then I mean, here's all three of them. First of all, just the triptych format right away is taking you to a religious context, a spiritual context, and then the reference to the crucifixion. That image on the right of the tormented figure, it reminds me, that sort of cloth over his head reminds me of in crucifixion scenes. There's particularly the deposition where Christ is being taken down from the cross. They're always holding him. There's a cloth, a white cloth. It's symbolic of the altar cloth. And it's always used to hold the body of Christ. So whenever I see that, it reminds me of that as well. These sort of like they're metamorphosing too. There's an element of them changing from one thing into another. He was preoccupied with terror. This is during the war, 44, and even after the war, even more so. This series brought him really overnight success. It's strangely even sexually charged, and I'm not even sure how or why that is, but it is. It has that power. Harold Rosenberg, art critic I mentioned before, who wrote about the abstract expressionists, he's the one that came up with the term action painting. Harold Rosenberg called these metaphysically depressed. I like that terminology because they kind of are metaphysically depressed. There's something about them that's like that.
Privately owned or?
I don't know who owns them at this point. I'm sure they're in a museum. I'm not sure where. Most of his work doesn't go into private hands anymore. In 1949, he started works like this. Now, this is Man in the Blue Box. And the Nuremberg trials were in 45, 46. I don't think they were televised. I know Eichmann's were, but that was much, much later. That was in the 60s. I don't know how much those trials were televised, but I know they were in newspapers. He was obsessed with the Holocaust. He was obsessed with, he's terrified anyway. I'm sure he personally identified because he was so tormented himself. But I did a little research on it, and this idea of this man in the box. When I think of a man in the box, I think of images that I have of the Eichmann trials, where he was in the glass box. But that was not the case in the Nuremberg trials in the 40s. They're in a kind of box, but there's no glass around them. So this is his invention, this almost claustrophobic space that he's creating. I'm not saying that this is meant to be from the Nuremberg trials. It doesn't, the title just says Man in Blue Box. But knowing his obsession with what's going on, I think this is related in some way with this screaming figure. Now you're getting like really thin washes of paint sort of striking down the side. So a powerful image, intense image. Is it to shut, is the sort of glass around him to shut him in? Is it to shut out the chaos? It's so that we don't hear him scream. It's an ambiguous space, an ambiguous message. This is a very famous work, his study after Velázquez, Pope Innocent II, where again you get another figure, this tormented figure. This is the painting that he's referencing. This is Velázquez, Pope Innocent X from 1650, but he's taking him to another whole place in general. Now, instead of a box around him, we've got these like lines that seem to rope him in or something. There's an enclosure. It's being suggested, these streaks. He said that he wanted it to look like a snail had just crawled across the surface. I mean, that's sort of what he's thinking. That screaming mouth is a powerful image. There's also an influence from this Titian painting, portrait of Cardinal Filippo Arcinto. Now, this is referencing this cardinal. Now, why, bigger question is, why is Titian in the 16th century painting with this sort of curtain over him? Well, this particular cardinal had been appointed Archbishop of Milan in 1556, and the Archbishop of Milan is a really high position. It's like second only to the Pope, actually. However, because of political machinations, whatever, he never was allowed to actually take the position. And Titian was his supporter. So he's showing the veil, suggesting that, like they've shut him out or something. That's why he's showing that way. But he's on his right hand, that ring that is visible is the ring of the archbishop that he should have had. So he's saying he's the archbishop, he should have been, but he got shut out. And the imagery itself is what's influencing Bacon here. That looked like looking through a film, to sort of see the image. The other influential element of this painting and on many of his paintings is that very, very famous scene from Eisenstein's Battleship Potemkin. Usually considered one of the best films ever made. It's an incredible movie, and this is the most famous scene from it, on the steps of the palace at St. Petersburg at the time of the Russian Revolution, and this scene zooms in, and this kind of image is so influential that it appears in a lot of different contexts. Every filmmaker knows this scene and knows this image, and it's really where the screaming figure is coming from. So this is a tormented person. How does he feel about the Catholic Church? Probably not very, very positively. Having been a young gay man in Ireland, I'm sure the church wasn't very kindly to him. And he was thrown out onto the streets to take care of himself. So I'm sure there's some commentary in there as well. Images like this, again, it's that similar face, head surrounded by sides of beef. I mean, there's literally a kind of rawness to it. Taking a figure like this, it looks again like a pope possibly, but it's also referencing Rembrandt. I mean, Rembrandt did images like this, the slaughtered ox from Rembrandt. So is he identifying with this sort of slaughtered animals? And it's powerful imagery. Believe it or not, he also painted portraits. I can't imagine it, but he was commissioned by many people to paint portraits. And this is his portrait of Isabel Rawsthorne. I mean, it's a powerful, disturbing image. His most famous portrait is a self-portrait. And I think I love this self-portrait. This is how he saw himself. This is him. And it looks like him. You can recognize him as distorted as it is. But I love the texture. You see the canvas and how thinly it's brushed, and a lot of dry brush technique that's left it really sort of raw. That's powerful. And that is Francis Bacon. There's a couple of movies out about him, or a new one or something being made too. I can't remember the context. He's very influential on British artists today. British artists really look to Francis Bacon. Not that they work in this way.
Is he a friend or something of Freud?
He would have known Lucian Freud. Yes, he would have known Lucian Freud. And I can't remember exactly what their relationship was, but I do remember there is a connection there. Lucian Freud is the son of Sigmund Freud. Lucian Freud really was British, really. He moved to and was really a British artist. So there is a connection there, and I have to look that up. But yeah, thank you. There is some connection there with Lucian Freud.
Well, I have a book about Saber family,
Yeah.
and it was about 1945 or 46, and they were in Greece. And Freud and Bacon were there too,
Okay.
and they met them, and
Wow. That would be incredible.
it was not, I mean, I think the author knew they were good, but they were real young.
Yeah. yeah, at that time, who knew who was going to be?
Wondered how they met.
Yeah, they were both in London working. If they were probably close to the same age, that would have made sense. You have to look that up. And lastly, Jean Dubuffet, French. Don't you just love those pictures? I just love those photographs. Just love them. Dubuffet is an interesting guy. Well, they're all interesting guys. What can I say? Jean Dubuffet had some interesting takes. He was an exponent of outsider art, and I'm going to talk more about that as well. He wasn't taken really seriously by the art community for a very, very long, till very, very late. He was considered a dilettante, not taken seriously. And that was not because of what he made, but because he really was a vintner. He took over his father's wine business in 1925 and started his own wine business in 1930. So he wasn't like full-time, I'm an artist. He ran a really successful business, and other artists looked down on him for that. They saw him as, you're just a weekend artist or whatever. If you were serious, you'd leave your job and do all of this, Anyway, the idea of working in a way like this, and this is fairly early, he didn't sort of begin working again until the 1940s. This is, what we call gaucherie, and I use that term. The first place I defined that term was when we were looking at Gauguin. In the 19th century, Gauguin used a lot of gaucherie, where you're intentionally creating something childlike. He's one of the earliest 19th century artists. Obviously, a lot of early 20th century artists were doing it intentionally as a way to tap into creativity, and we talked about a lot of that. But that sort of intentional lack of sophistication is not done for the same reasons, not by the 40s. It's not about creativity anymore. So View of Paris, very much like a child would depict it. Large Sooty Nude from 44. His work is he's thinking of anthracite coal. That's where this reference comes from. This is not totally dissimilar from what de Kooning was doing with the women, where there's a physicality to them, a sort of primal archetypal quality, and the psychology of it is important to Dubuffet. They're not totally unlike. When I see them side by side, there are big differences. However, their intentions are different. Where de Kooning is dealing with the creative process and what an artist does to wrest a figure from its ground. De Kooning has a figure that's struggling with the ground, that's sort of trapping it there and trying to break free. And it's about that process of creating that form, where Dubuffet seems to be looking more toward the primal nature. But he does deal with archetypes. Again, we saw the abstract expressionists dealing with Jungian archetypes. In fact, this is titled Archetypes. He's not even making us guess what it's about. He's telling us. And this is, of course, reminiscent of what Pollock was doing with sort of male and female and as archetypes of the anima and animus. Remember we talked about Jung's archetypes, psychological archetypes. Clearly, they are similar in what's happening. But all of that is leading us to Dubuffet's collection, his Art Brut or Art Brut collection. That's what he's really known for more than anything else. Art Brut translates roughly as raw art or unfinished. He called it raw. In 1947, he opened the Institute for Art Brut, which closed soon after, but then fortunately for us reopened. Someone else reopened it in the 70s. He was more and more fascinated with the idea of outsiders. And outsiders meaning anyone who's not tutored in the standard, art world. If you're not coming up and if you don't know what's going on in the art world, and you're just making art, but totally outside of the context and outside of the influence of what's going on in the main institutionalized art world, you're considered an art outsider. And there's a huge interest from the 60s on in outsider art. People like, primitives like Grandma Moses and all these people who are just out there making art, but they don't know what's going on in New York and they don't care what's going on in New York. But what Dubuffet was interested in was what at that time was referred to as the art of the insane. And there was a real interest in it. Psychology is new at the end of the 19th century and into the 20th. A German Dr. Hans Prinzhorn wrote a book called Art of the Mentally Ill, and that was in 1923. And we know that Dubuffet had that book. Well, he read it in 1923. I don't know when Prinzhorn wrote it. I think it was actually late 19th century. But he began visiting mental institutions and collecting art that people were drawing and making. And what he was primarily looking at was the art of schizophrenics. Almost all of this has been identified as imagery made by schizophrenics, which has very specific properties that you see over and over again. An obsessiveness and a repetition is one of the qualities that you see over and over again. And that's what he was fascinated with, because he developed this really interesting take on what schizophrenia was and what it meant. And I don't think anybody's ever had quite this interpretation before. He saw these people as escaping cultural conditioning. Like if you're totally outside the cultural milieu, he saw them as raw, uncooked. This is anthropological terminology. Anthropologists refer to cultures as either cooked or raw. We're a cooked culture. Raw cultures would be, tribal cultures that haven't been indoctrinated yet into a particular cultural system. So what some people saw as sort of madness or mental illness, he saw as the ultimate refusal to conform. That's how he saw it. He saw it as absolute individualism. He saw it as positive in that it was a sort of regenerative process, a rational response to modern culture and its absurdities. So he, in a sense, almost saw it as a choice, not a conscious choice, but a subconscious choice not to submit to cultural norms. Now, that's such an interesting way to think about, who are we to say, you're not normal, we are. Maybe we're not normal and they are, but that's certainly how he's thinking about it. So he saw it as almost like a defensive response. And therefore, he's going to be really, really interested in the art they make, because this is the expression of someone who's not conforming to cultural norms or programmings, sort of constantly fighting against society. And so he opened this gallery just showing this art brut, as it's called. And I'm so glad they reopened it again in 67, and it's still there in Paris. You can go to the Museum of Art Brut and see it. And it begins eventually sort of affecting his work. And images like this, Business Prospers, it has that somewhat. I mean, I don't think you could confuse it for actual art of schizophrenics, but it nonetheless has that sort of frenetic quality and that sort of obsessive quality and detail. It still has the sort of gaucherie, the childlike quality, more so than real art brut does. Because let me back up for a second. I don't think these are particularly childlike at all. I think they're quite sophisticated, but nonetheless, they are sort of obsessive imagery. Children aren't focused enough to be that obsessive. And this sort of has a little bit of both. It's sort of the child quality and intensity of color and obsessiveness. But you see, things like this change of view where you're getting what appear to be kind of maybe archetypal figures again, and other sorts of figures in there too. There's surrealist influence in this as well, in the way figures sort of merge and disappear and the like. But that obsessiveness of the lines is what he's getting from art brut. He's also very well known for his sculptures. Before Trees, for example. This is in New York. Yeah, this is the one in New York. This was commissioned by David Rockefeller for One Chase Manhattan Plaza in New York. And it's interesting in the context of public art. Again, this works pretty well as public art. He's made it so that it's open, so that it's not massive and sort of weighing down the space. It's not sort of closing off the space, and you can walk through it and under it. And it's trees. I mean, the reference to trees is interesting. They're tree-like forms, so it pulls you in.
What is
So
it made of? Do we know? What is it made
yeah,
of?
that's a good question. I don't know.
Durable, but I don't know.
So maybe
It's outside. Yeah, I have to look that up. How is it I don't know that? I don't know. I'm going to find out. We will find out before next week. That's a really good question. Some of his are colorful. Some of them, in this case, just black and white. I think he left this one because of the nature of the building itself. I think he didn't want this all different bright colors. I think this works well with the building. But he's quite successful public artist. He has a lot of outdoor pieces, good sized pieces, and they also work. There's a playfulness to them.
Suzanne says it's plastic.
Plastic.
Plastic over an aluminum frame.
Yeah, that makes sense that it would be aluminum frame, but plastic. That makes sense. That would be weighty and a good structure, but the plastic wouldn't hold up. Here's another view. You can see it from underneath. And that is all I had for today. Does anybody have, again, any comments or questions? Because I think these artists really sort of sum up much of the modernist movement. A lot of what we saw earlier was sort of getting us to this point. And this sort of wraps up many of those qualities and characteristics. The various points of view come together.
We have the Calder video of the animated circus. Have you ever seen that?
Oh, I have seen that video. It's really fun. That's great. Yeah, no, it is fun. He's like a little child. He's very childlike in many ways. So yeah, that's fun. So all of this slowly begins ending. And it's a process that happens through the latter, from starting about 58, 59, things begin changing. And it's all at the hands of Americans. Postmodernism comes from Americans. And so by the 60s, we begin to be in a different world. And that's what I'm going to talk about next time. It's interesting because it's happening in the 60s, which means it begins to be written about in the 80s, because it takes 20 years before people can begin to see what was happening. So that means the 80s is the decade, if you want to read about what postmodernism is, that's the 80s. The 80s was this incredible decade for art, criticism, theory, and writing. And what they recognized was that things had changed, but how did it happen? What did it change? What do we call it? What ended? And it's in the 80s where people begin to define modernism for the first time. Now, people in the 19th century were trying to understand what it meant to be modern. What is it to be in the modern world? What am I doing that's modern? How am I living that's modern? But to define modernism as an art movement is something that happens in the 80s, because they knew things had changed, and they're going to call it postmodern. We know we're coming after modern, so we're going to call it postmodern. So we can't define what postmodern means until we define what modern meant. So the first attempts to really define the modernist movement were in the 1980s, and incredible writings. And there's a lot of hits and misses and starts and stops and mistakes and a lot of great writing that, doesn't make sense afterwards. But then they begin to try and understand who they are. And I have to admit that was where that's where I sort of dropped out of the conversation. And that's when I was in grad school and I was absorbing all this 80s stuff, and it was just incredible and what was happening. And then I finished grad school and got a job. You know what happens when that happens? You don't have time for all this stuff. That's, grad school is this gift. It's this leisure time to learn all these things. But when you get out of that, you simply don't have that time anymore. And what you're working on and writing is something else. It's based on your own work because you want to get tenure and you want to get promotion, and you're focused on that. And I just never kept up with art theory after that because that wasn't really my area or my interest. So I know through the 80s really well, but beyond that, I would never attempt to try and discuss or talk about, because I just haven't kept up. And honestly, I don't have that much interest to do so, or I would, but I just don't. So we'll get you up through the 80s for sure. With a preview, I mean, once you understand the 80s, from that you can see where everything else is going. I mean, there isn't anything happening now that doesn't come out of at least by the 80s, or 60s, 70s, and 80s. That's the foundation of postmodern. Any other questions, comments, anything? If not, we'll meet one more time next week. Last time, wrap this up, and I'll see you next week, everybody. Bye-bye.
Hi, Peggy. Sorry, I only got.
Bye, everybody. We'll see you
Good to
next
see you.
week.